this is a historic moment that we are in, and not necessarily brimming with optimism. So I think it's a good moment to also to understand and look back at even recent history. And I just want you to take, all of us to go back to the MDGs. Many of us, I think in this group, most of us did say that these were not Millennium Development Goals, but they were minimum development goals. Because we thought that the framing was extremely problematic. It was looking at questions of extreme poverty with a narrow lens. And then came the SDGs. The civil society did want the SDGs to have a much higher bar. And I do think that we failed in that opportunity. And the Sustainable Development Goals, though hugely ambitious in many ways, is still short of the mark that we must have reached. It is still a lens of development and poverty and does not use the lens of human rights and justice. I think that's something critical that I just wanted to particularly highlight, that it would have been very important and it would have been a very different framing if ensuring justice for all, ensuring human rights for all would have been at the center, would have been the fulcrum of the entire SDG framework. Let me also say that you have the 17 goals, most of them are powerful goals, but I do still feel goal number 16, which is our conversation today, was probably the weakest amongst all. I was part of several of those conversations, and I do think that one of the problems of the framing of the SDGs was we kept saying with great excitement, and I share that excitement, that this is a first global compact which brings economic, social, and environmental together. But we missed a very important fourth stool, that was the political. So that pillar of ensuring political also as a fundamental pillar of the SDGs was critical. We missed that pass. And I think what we're looking at today is a reflection of how we were not able to incorporate the political questions into the discussions. I just also wanted to say that while the framing was happening, the world outside the ivory towers of the UN was also changing dramatically. I'm not very sure how much of that did get incorporated in the SDGs. So, let me just flag one or two pieces. The 2008 meltdown, the global meltdown, the recession. One could say that we see the goal number 10 precisely because of that. Otherwise, it would not have been there. And also, we saw in 2011 the Arab Spring happening and people's movement across several countries. That certainly has not been incorporated. So that's the history I just wanted to bring in, because if we are moving ahead, we will need to look at some of these questions with greater depth. What are we seeing today? We are looking at authoritarian regimes across, from east to west. And these authoritarian regimes are actually using the language of democracy and very often instruments of democracy to then move towards greater authoritarian states, towards shrinking of space for civil society, for civic action, for human rights. So that's one trend. But in all this scenario, and that story starts from Philippines to my country to Turkey, it just goes on. It's across the globe. But on the other hand, I also say that there is remarkable people's power across the world that we see. And I don't have the time, but if you just look at the stories of struggles, of spontaneous people's struggles against authoritarian regimes, at least in Asia, we can certainly celebrate what we have seen in Hong Kong last year. A remarkable people's power challenging draconian laws. So in this context, I think it is a historic moment for all of us. How do we move ahead? When I must say, I talked of the authoritarian regimes, let me just add one more thing. This is probably the biggest challenge on the post-war consensus around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that challenge is diluting the core normative values of democracy, of inclusion, of pluralism, and of human. I think it's important for us to keep that at the center of this People's Assembly that we have, and try and see what can we do as people of this globe. How do we ensure a sustainable future? How do we rebuild democracies in different societies? And I have just, three or four specific thoughts. I'll end with that. I know my time is almost over, but let me just give you very specific suggestions. Hopefully during the next 3 hours we can discuss them. The first one, I think it's very, very important that we rebuild democracy. There's a huge deficit of trust in terms of democracy, particularly representative democracy. And what we are seeing is crony capitalism, obscene levels of inequality. But this is a moment where we'll need to invest in rebuilding democracy bottom up, pretty much brick by brick. So how do we ensure citizens' dialogues, societies communicating with each other? I think that's one big piece that we need to work on. The second, I think it's very important that we need to get the whole human rights discourse out of the clutches of a technocratic approach. Not just the lawyers, every citizen, every person should be able to both understand and speak the language of human rights. It's critical. It's hard work. In patriarchal societies, in the casteist society that I live in discriminatory regimes, it's going to be difficult. But I think there's no alternative to building a human rights discourse around, built by people themselves, and not just through lawyers or the corridors of UN. And the third, and I'll end with that, is, SDG also talks of leave no one behind. Can we actually bring the last person to the center of all our conversations? It's going to be critical. Can we start reimagining democracy from the lens of the last person, be it a minority in my country, or be it the women in Afghanistan, or the most marginalized, the most excluded communities, are the ones who should be at the center of reimagining democracy, of reimagining a robust democracy where people's right, human dignity, and the rights of Mother Earth are respected. Thank you for inviting me, and all the best for the deliberations that we'll have over the next 3 hours. Thank you.